All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Dunk on AP podcast. Today we are talking about 6.6 and 6.7 of AP World, the causes of migration in an interconnected world, and also the outcomes of migration in said interconnected world. So, without further ado, let's go dunk on AP. So, getting started here. Migration, of course, refers to the movement of people from one area to another with the intent of settling, permanently or temporarily, in a new location. This movement can occur within national borders, internal migration, or across international boundaries, which is external migration. So, some factors that influence migration from 1750 to 1900. You had economic motivations. For example, the California Gold Rush from 1848 to 1855. You had demographic changes. For example, the Irish potato famine from 1845 to 1849. And then you had advances in transportation technology. For example, the expansion of the steamship and railway networks. Then you had shifts in local, in social, and political conditions. For example, the abolition of slavery and serfdom in Russia. So, push and pull factors, of course. Push factors are conditions that drive people to leave their home country or region. These are usually negative forces within the country of origin. Pull factors are positive opportunities of a new country or region. The pull factors actually lure people and families to relocate to improve their quality of life. So the different types of labor migration. You had enslavement. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly relocated millions of Africans across the Atlantic to work in harsh conditions on plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean. You had convict labor. Convict labor involved the transportation of convicts from Britain and other European countries to penal colonies, most notably to Australia, as a solution for overcrowded prisons. Then you had indentured servitude. This was a labor system where individuals entered into a contract to work for a specific employer for a period in exchange for passage to a new country, usually in America or the Caribbean. Then there was contract labor. Contract labor was a form of migration where workers, often from Asia, particularly from China, agreed to work for an employer in a foreign country under a fixed term contract. So let's talk a little bit about transportation technology. So steamships reduced the cost and duration of travel. This increased safety and accessibility. Mass movement of Europeans to the Americas and Australia happened because of steamship travel. The Suez Canal shortens the sea voyage from Europe to South Asia and Australia. Railways transform internal migration patterns because people are able to move so much more freely now. And the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad gets built in 1869. The Trans-Siberian Railroad gets built from 1891 to 1916. Now, let's talk about these a few different waves of migration. So you have the transatlantic slave trade. The slave trade continues through 1807 for Britain. That's when it ends. And then technically the importation of slaves will be illegal in 1808 for America, but really 1865 is the end of slavery for America. The main places that people are leaving from are the main place that people are moving from is leaving from is West Africa in the transatlantic slave trade, and their main destinations. And I would say this is in the order of where they're going as far as the frequency of where they're going: Brazil, the Caribbean, and the United States. So the push factors are kidnapping, warfare with local tribes, and trade by African and European slavers that are forcing their migration. There are really no pull factors for enslaved people because they didn't have a choice in the matter of coming to the region that they went to, whether that was Brazil, the Caribbean, the Americas. So the Irish potato famine. The push factors here: potato blight leading to famine, poverty, and death in Ireland. Then the pull factors were the availability of land, economic opportunities in communities and destination countries that were already living there. The main destinations for the people leaving because Ireland because of the Irish potato famine are the United States, Canada, and Australia. Now, Italian migration. This was from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. Some push factors: poverty, land scarcity, and political unrest in Italy. Then some pull factors: industrial employment opportunities and established migrant opportunities in the place that they were going to. For example, in the United States, Argentina, and Brazil. So, moving on now to Indian indentured servitude. So, some push factors here for Indian people going to different areas. Push factors were poverty, famine, and disruption caused by British colonial policies in India. Then Pull factors would be demand for labor on sugar and rubber plantation under contracts that promised wages and an eventual return to India. And Indian indentured servitude will be going from India to the Caribbean, Fiji, Mauritius, and South Africa. So then you've got Chinese migration from the 1850s to the early 1900s, and this one is particularly important. The push factors for them are civil unrest under the Qing Empire. Then you've got famine and economic hardship as well. But you've also got pull factors like employment opportunities in gold mines. You've got railroads, and you've also got opportunities for them to be merchants in burgeoning communities. The destinations that Chinese migrants are going to were the United States, Southeast Asia, Australia, and South Africa. Now, Russian expansion and Siberian exile. So, some push factors here in the 18th and 19th century were political exile, penal labor, and military conscription. Some pull factors were government incentives for settlers, such as land grants and tax exemptions, to solidify Russian control over Siberia, which is the northern part of Russia. The Siberian population increases 73% between 1897 and 1914 due to the incentives to settle Siberia. Now, Japanese migration. So, some push factors here. The Meiji Restoration led to rural displacement. Again, if you're going to industrialize that quick, you're gonna feel that in your rural areas, and economic hardship for many farmers. You also had overpopulation and poverty in rural areas. So, pull factors. There was demand for labor in sugarcane plantations in Hawaii. There were development projects on the U.S. mainland and coffee plantations in Brazil. There was also the promise of higher wages and a better standard of living. The Hawaiian government and private companies in these destinations actively recruited Japanese laborers. Then you've got Lebanese migration, and the primary place that they're going here. But just maybe I'll just backtrack 1 second. Japanese migrants were primarily going to Hawaii, the U.S. mainland, Brazil, and Peru. Now, Lebanese migration from the late 19th century to the early 20th century. The push factors here are economic hardship, religious persecution, and political instability under Ottoman rule. Now, Mount Lebanon, so there was the civil conflict of 1860 and subsequent tensions coming from that. Then some pull factors for Lebanese that were migrating. You had pull factors that like economic opportunities in trade, industry, and commerce. You had the promise of political and religious freedom. You had the allure of joining established Lebanese and Syrian communities in the Americas and other regions. Now, the whole thing here is this is all going to come with big effects. As people move, there are going to be effects to this, of course. Now, some migrant gender dynamics. There were different pull factors for men and women in voluntary labor migration. So the employment opportunities driven by labor demands attracted mostly male migrants. There were limited opportunities for women at this time. So women who remained in the home country often took on traditionally male roles. So then there was an effect on Italian. There were the effects of Italian immigration. So there was significant economic and social upheaval. This led to Italian immigration from the 19th to the 20th century. So the initial immigration was predominantly male, and greater numbers of women followed later. So Italian women in Italy took on greater responsibilities in agriculture and household management. If you took me for AP Human Geography, we would call this chain migration. So this changed the Italian family dynamic, and it also contributed to women's rights in Italy because a lot of men had left and they had gone to America. Now, the effects of migration, you tend to get ethnic enclaves. These were geographic areas with a high concentration of people from the same ethnicity. It was characterized by distinct cultural, social, and economic practices that differentiate them from the surrounding community. And so some effects of that is that, ethnic enclaves are going to be crucial for migrant survival and well-being in the host country. So they provide ethnic goods, services, social networks, and support for new migrants. So you have Indians in the colony of Natal in southern Africa. So Indian indentured servants came to work on sugar plantations and escape poverty and famine. The Indian community in Natal formed ethnic enclaves. This helped develop the agricultural industry there in Natal. So this influenced early civil rights movements. You have Mahatma Gandhi and the Natal India Congress that are going to be part of Indian Congress. They're going to be a part of that. So then you have Chinese migration to the United States. You're also going to have Chinese migration to Australia, and that is going to kick up quite a bit of controversy. So there's going to be growing anti-Chinese sentiments in the U.S. because Chinese workers will remain in the U.S. after the gold rush in 1849 and after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. So the Chinese were willing to work for lower wages and do more dangerous jobs than American workers were. And this is going to lead to a prevailing sentiment of xenophobia and racism. Because of that, labor unions are going to begin lobbying politicians to stop Chinese immigration. So, what this is going to lead to is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was passed by Chester Arthur, and so this put a 10-year moratorium on Chinese labor immigration. So, the first law implemented to prevent a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the United States was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this act was renewed all the way up until its repeal in 1943. And that allowed for small numbers of Chinese immigrants and the ability of Chinese immigrants to gain US citizenship. So then Australia has a gold rush as well in the 1850s, and this results in an influx of immigrants that changed Australia's social landscape. The goldfields of Victoria in New South Wales were major destinations for immigrants. 40,000 Chinese immigrants arrived between 1851 and 1871. So this led to some anti-Chinese riots like the Buckland riot of 1857 and the Lambing riots of Lambing Flat riots of 1861. So some anti-Chinese laws were passed in Australia as well. The Victorian Act of 1855 was the first law passed to restrict Chinese immigration in Australia. This limited the number of Chinese immigrants on incoming vessels, but it did not really stop Chinese immigration. So then you have the Chinese Immigration Regulation and Restriction Act of 1861. So New South Wales restrictions on Chinese immigration, including fees. And then it also forbade the naturalization of Chinese immigrants. And then on top of this, you've got an influx of Chinese Restriction Act in 1881. This was passed in New South Wales Parliament. And the goal was to restrict the influx of Chinese workers from other colonies in the Australian continent. And this is of course going to be part of really a part of the White Australia policy, which was a promotion of a homogenous white British derived population, and this was inaugurated with the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. And this was dismantled between the 1940s and the 1970s. So what we talked about here was migration from 1750 to 1900. What caused it, and then what were the effects of it?